Good morning. My name is Pamela Carpio, and I'm Senior Coordinator, Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym, the GSSB, held on the 25th of March, 2019. This in-person meeting is being hosted from the Netherlands, Amsterdam. Please note that all GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB webpage, along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastien Buck, Chief of Standards, and Gillian Balaban, Standards Assistant. We will now start with a roll call. Corlie Leroux.
Good morning.
Thank you. Evan Harvey.
Present.
Good morning. Gustavo Sinner.
Here, present.
Thank you. Jennifer Prinzin.
Good morning.
Thank you. Kent Swift.
Good morning.
Thank you. Kirsten Margret Ovi.
Present.
Thank you. Loredana Carta.
Good morning.
Thank you. Michel Wacher.
Present.
Thank you. Peter Colley.
Good morning.
Thank you. Robin Leeson.
Present.
Thank you. Judy Kuzewski, GSSB Chair.
Present.
Thank you. Please note that GSSB member Tony Mo will join a little bit later, and the following GSSB members send their apologies: Julia Wilson, Rama Krishnan, and Vincent Kong. I will now hand to the chair, Judy Kuzewski, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Pamela, and welcome to everyone to this meeting in Amsterdam and to those who are listening in as well. We have a variety of things to go through today in this in-person meeting. I'd like to turn your attention, first of all, just to the agenda and just have a quick look at what all we hope to accomplish today. Do we have a slide? It doesn't seem to want to work. There we are. Okay. Right. Okay. So we start simply with the usual overview of the agenda, and we'll look at the summary of the most recent meeting in February. We then have an update from the Standards Division with respect to a wide range of things that are currently underway or being considered or pursued in the Standards Division, before we go into a discussion of the proposed standard on tax and payments to governments, which closed for public comment the week before last. Then we have a short break, following which we will look at the review of the GRI waste disclosures and a general update on the sector program as well, which will have quite a few different elements to it. Then we'll break for lunch. And then we have quite a tricky discussion, I would say, about the recommendations from the Human Rights Technical Committee. There are a number of choices that fall out of the work that group has done in the first phase, and we will be joined in that. Will that be before or after the break that Dwight will be joining us, or for the whole thing? For the whole thing. Dwight Justice, who's one of our previous GSSB members, who has served as a liaison to, sponsor of that technical committee, will be joining us to help us talk through some of the discussions and the results of those discussions, and help us to sort of understand some of the choices that we need to make. We have a project proposal to look at the universal standards, which is a direct consequence of the Human Rights Technical Committee work. And following that, we'll close right around 5 o'clock, I would say. We do hope to keep it to a normal working day today. Then we can look at tomorrow's agenda quickly. There's a second part of the project proposal to review the universal standards, which we'll start with after the just opening of the meeting, followed by a morning break. Then we have an executive session when we will not be on the public record. So this will be background discussion of a number of things. For those who aren't familiar with the process, we don't take any decisions in executive session or in private at all. All of the private discussions are purely information and discussion. And we have some administrative matters as well. After lunch tomorrow, we'll be looking at the forward planning, the GSSB work program for the coming, it's usually about a 3-year period that we tend to look at in the work program. And then we'll close the meeting in the mid to late afternoon, around 3:30 tomorrow, which I think is probably in plenty of time for most of you with your travel plans to go back home. Yeah? Are there any questions? Anything unclear about the agenda the next 2 days? Okay, thank you very much. So the first thing on our agenda today is the summary of the 7th of February meeting. Do we have any discussion or comments or clarifications from that meeting summary that anybody would like to make? No? Okay, well, with no objections, I think we can safely say that that one has gone through, which brings us to the general update from the Standards Division.
The SC documents, just to acknowledge the recommendations. We had them as part of the first session as well.
The recommendations of the SC.
Yeah.
We do, yes, absolutely. So that'll be part of this that we're just about to do. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, so we'll just simply state that there's been a set of recommendations received from the Stakeholder Council, which we will be discussing at various times throughout the course of the agenda because it pertains to a number of different things that we're working on. So, Bastian.
Yes, thank you, Judy, and welcome also from me. We start with a general update from the Standards Division, but we will keep it very, very brief because we are actually covering most of the projects in quite some depth at this meeting. For where we are right now, I think one thing you can say is that we're almost exclusively focused on the rollout of the different projects that you have approved over the course of the last year. There's very little idle capacity within the Standards Division to look at other projects that we always had on the wish list. Where I wanted to start is to say that we now have a headcount of 18 for the Standards Division, so we slowly but surely keep growing, and we're approaching the 20 staff members. We're coming from just around 10 staff members 4 years ago, and so we keep adding. Most recently, our team around the sector program, where since August last year, 4 new team members have joined to build capacity to roll out this major program. In terms of trends that I have for you, I think one particularly interesting one and that reminds also around us of the interest level in the standards is we have had in the last year more than 230,000 downloads of the standards from the GI website. And what you see is that now more and more organizations actually move to the implementation of the standards, but we keep actually adding to the number of people that are returning to the website to look at revised standards, download new versions. And we have right now 114,000 active users that have downloaded standards and are returning to download standards, which is comparably high for if you look at the G4 levels. And we are also adding every month, and I think that's the most positive thing here. We are adding every month new users also. The months where we see particularly high traffic is in October, when the reporting season for most multinationals really starts. But every month we have at least 3,000, and it ranges up to 10,000 downloads a month at the moment. And I should say that we still have to see a real consolidation. I think every month we're adding to the numbers in comparison to the year before. Important for us is also to look at that we build up mailing lists or contact lists for people that want to be close to us, that we can inform about your projects, and that we have recent and updated contact information for. As some of you know, those who operate in Europe, we had the introduction of GDPR last year, which means that every contact needs to be verified, but also the contact needs to opt in to receive certain information. We've gone through a quite elaborate process to verify contacts, and we're now up to 28,000 contacts that we can mail directly, and we hope to build that out over the course of the next year to around 100,000, so that we come closer to the number of users that we also have on the website. So what we use this for specifically is for things like alerting members, alerting interested parties about public comment, alerting them to new standards, revision projects, and then we have mailings that go out on defined dates. When you look at this, oh, sorry. It's not working. Well, when you look at the, I will just do that without the slide, the translations that we have currently in the public domain. We have 9 languages: Spanish, Indonesian, Bahasa, Japanese, Vietnamese, Arabic, French, German, traditional Chinese, and simplified Chinese. And Italian is underway. 25% of the downloads that we currently see are basically driven by translations, and we expect that more of this will come. We're not planning to have very many more languages, but what we see in particular, Spanish receives a lot of attention and is opening up a whole host of new markets, well, we always had them. We had Spanish translations for G3 and G4, but it shows that this is very important for us to maintain. And we have capacity now in the standards division with a dedicated colleague just for our publications business. And also, Kari is spending quite some time on translations exclusively, and we see that this is quite important in terms of driving the numbers. When you look at the projects underway, we have the tax and payments to government, what we will discuss in a moment in the first session, and we hope to close this by the end of the year. Waste disclosures we have tabled today for approval for exposure, and we hope by the end of the year we're also moving to approval with a launch likely early 2020. The human rights disclosures and the universal standards project will span at least into the Q1. In actual fact, probably the launch will be in Q2 of 2020. And we are also discussing today the sector program with oil and gas, the first project that we ask you to approve, scheduled to run till June 2020, and agriculture will follow in the next months and will span likely to the end of 2020. With the projects that you see here, and that we will discuss over the course of the day, we're keeping the 18 staff members fairly busy. I think it's not. It's probably accurate to say that between 80 to 90% of the capacity goes into conducting these projects. Naturally, there are moments within the projects where there's a bit of a downtime with the exposure periods, but this is usually where we actually catch up and do other things that are left for us to do in the downtime, and also prepare for the next set of projects. I think all projects are currently on schedule, but we will have discussions today in relation to the human rights and universal standards, depending on the scope of these projects. They might take more time. And importantly also for the sector program, we will walk you a bit through the considerations of why we are staging the projects, which is also a resource consideration. In terms of other things that I wanted to mention to you, there is one development in particular. All of you are following, of course, the CSR news and the sustainability news. There's one development in particular that we've taken note of, and that is on the EU level, the work that is occurring in the implementation of the non-financial directive. And in particular the guidelines that are written for non-financial reporting. I'm bringing this to your attention because this is a reference point in very many of our external engagements at the moment, certainly in Europe, but also beyond. And what it, in a nutshell, what it is in the guidelines that are currently for public comment. Actually, I think the public consultation closed last week. The European Commission and the experts that they have involved propose basically a double materiality concept. They look at financial materiality and then what they call environmental and social materiality and the relationship between the two. Importantly, they look at it for very much focused on the climate change impacts and the climate change impacts of a company, as well as climate change as an issue and how it impacts the company. But it is basically along the lines of the NFR directive and the introduction a couple of years ago, a further exemplification of GRI's approach to materiality and defining report content that is gaining more and more traction, I think, also with regulators. And it is an important debate. We had a colleague who was directly also involved in the process. It is an important debate that is currently happening. How much of these two materiality definitions, if you want to paraphrase it like this, needs to coexist, and it is a timely, I think, input also for our discussion on the universal standards. I think we've been waiting for a long time for an expression of this also from the side of regulators, acknowledging that there are two pillars to the corporate reporting and the need to also see the relationship between the two. And it is quite a positive, I would say, development for GRI to build on now in the process of the further rollout of the NFR directive, because it drives also a lot of those that implement the NFR directive back to GRI, and we hope to see that back in the numbers and the adoption as well. One other development that is also noteworthy is that IOSCO, the umbrella organization of the financial market regulators, has issued a paper on ESG in which the GRI standards are mentioned directly and the work of GRI. Also there, it is something that we can really build on in terms of gaining traction globally. It was not something that we necessarily expected. Based on well, many years of discussions, but not really expressions of interest in non-financial reporting matters. Now, finally, it's there. We're mentioned alongside others, but it is important that GRI is in that discussion as well, and it will come in very handy also when we reach out to policymakers globally. These are the points that I wanted to mention as a general update. I'm not sure whether members have seen any other updates from GRI that you have questions about, things that, developments that you've noted that you wanted to share at this stage.
Anyone?
It's more just a query, Bastian, with that last slide. I see the reference to employees. Was I'm just querying whether that was a deliberate choice, or whether we would normally stick to the term workers, as in those who do work for the company.
Yeah, so this
Regardless of
is
their
not,
employment form.
this is the European Commission.
Okay.
And well, you probably just missed the chance to provide comment on that. Maybe your colleagues did, but it's yeah. They usually refer to employees in the non-financial reporting guidance. Yeah, but it is true for the GI contents. It is always the workers that we refer to, unless it is specifically on the employees that are targeted.
Just a very quick comment. In Europe, workers refer to a special category of employees. You have employees which are not workers. You have ouvriers, employés, and managers. So workers are a special category which have special contracts. So usually when you use the word workers in Europe, you're addressing only a specific category of employees. That's all.
Anyone else? Corley.
Thanks, Julie. Just it's more of a question around the corporate reporting dialogue and the better reporting project, just to get a little bit of a sense for what's the role of the GSSB in developing the standards and working together with the Secretariat in the alignment.
So there is a project underway that some of you might have noted also in the public domain. It's called the Better Alignment Project. It's part of the corporate reporting dialogue that brings together, next to GRI, the IRC, CDP, CDSB, and then FASB and IFRS. In that dialogue, sorry, I should also mention SASB is part of it as well. In that dialogue, there is a project that is currently focused on the TCFD recommendations and trying to establish what the overlap between the different standards, setters, frameworks is with regards to climate change disclosure, and to explore how much of alignment is possible between the different standards. It is, at this stage, an exploratory research. The standards division is directly involved in providing the technical background to this. It is a follow-up, I think, to our discussions that we had last year to actually issue also more of a guidance around how you can use GI to implement the TCFD recommendations. That will be a logical outcome also of that process. What we do with a group of other standard setters is right now to explore what's actually the detailed overlap on a metrics, so indicator level. And it will be issued under the umbrella of the corporate reporting dialogue. I think it's scheduled for early third quarter this year. A publication that summarizes the findings. It's important to note, and that's sometimes, well, not characterized correctly. I think this project does not constitute a commitment to align anything just yet. I think it is an input then for the GSSB to look at the outcomes and say, is there a possibility to do more around aligning metrics with others? Importantly, the TCFD has, of course, they have suggested certain disclosures, but they've also said very clearly that they're building on the work of others. And here I would highlight in particular, I think, the opportunity to maybe align even further with CDP. Because this is where you probably combine most of the multinationals reporting, either with CDP or GI, or actually both. And there are still nuances, differences, even for the core disclosures. That's a product of two things. One is us updating the standards only every so often, but also CDP actually, generally speaking, for the questionnaires, they update them every year. So they move a bit faster, and they're also, of course, more granular. Bringing that together, there is an opportunity there. We've been working, of course, with them also over the course of the years, and have always issued guidance documents for companies that apply both, so that they can use the response to one of the two frameworks to also fill in the other information request. I think I'm positive about issuing a publication together with the colleagues from the other frameworks by the third quarter. I think that that's achievable, and probably if we manage to do that, then we can bring that back to the GSB at the September meeting in terms of implications for maybe the greenhouse gas related standard.
Kirsten.
I agree to very much of what you're saying about CDP. At the same time, it's important to be aware of certain weaknesses related to CDP that are, in my opinion, pretty serious, and that has made more and more large companies to restrain from using CDP. I'm not there at all that I would say that the CDP is not relevant, because it is. But we have to take care in how we are cooperating with CDP and how we are using, or what we would recommend to use by the CDP framework.
Yeah, and I think it's important, that also goes to Corley's question. I think that there is no action in terms of alignment, actual alignment of metrics or anything taken without your involvement and without tabling that also the outcomes just of the research with you. And I think then we have directionally to decide what could a project look like, where we move and try to bring these closer together, if that is actually a real thing. I think the one thing that I should note also in this context is that probably the main driver of at least the high-level metrics on the greenhouse gas emissions is actually the WRI, WBCSD, GHG protocol, which we both try to align to, and that's probably in this context also an element that we should consider at the time. Of course, in the TCFD there are other disclosures in relation to what we have on governance, the general disclosures and the ownership of the issue within the governance structure, and that's something that we will naturally be able to also consider probably also beyond the TCFD mandate as part of the universal standards review, and we will discuss that later today and tomorrow.
Michel.
Very shortly, it's just to confirm every word that Margaret said about CDP.
Right, thank you very much. Shall we move on? Any other discussion here? Bastian, before we get into the tax and payments to government, did you want to say something about the comments received from the Stakeholder Council? There are two of the documents that are in your...
Yeah. And while Mia gets ready to present the tax update, so we have items 2 and 3, I think, for you. So the item 2, the Stakeholder Council response to the GSB sector standards proposal and the proposal for review of the universal standards. These responses we will bring back in the respective sessions. It is part of the due process that we consult the the SC at the outset and also the GRI board at the outset of projects for their feedback, and to the extent that you feel that it is warranted, this feedback can be taken on board. So we will bring that back in the respective sessions. And then there's one more set of, and that's item 3, of recommendations that are of more generic nature. They pertain mostly to the work program of the GSB, so we will bring that up tomorrow in the work program related session. It is important to note the origin of these recommendations. The SC provided recommendations to the GRI board, and the GRI board basically delegated part of these recommendations to the GSB for consideration, because the GRI board felt that the recommendations are actually pertaining to issues that are under the mandate of the GSSB. And tomorrow, when we have our work program discussion, we will have a closer look at those recommendations as an input, and also discuss briefly how we respond to the SC after our work program discussions. But it is, since it is a due process relevant component, and the SC has invested heavily to bring all the members together and submit one set of recommendations, it's important that we acknowledge this today.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Mia Dadimar from the Standards Division to talk us through the next bit on our agenda, which is the update on the project related to tax and payments to government. You want to put on your microphone? Yeah.
Thank you, Judy. This update will be relatively short. Unfortunately, it's a little bit early for us to bring any particular insights around comments that we've received, but I just wanted to give you a quick update on where we ended up after the public comment. I'm sorry, is there a clicker? Thank you. Okay, so as you all may remember, or for those of you who weren't in the GSSB at the time, following on from the approval of the exposure draft of the tax and payments to government standard back in November, we opened a 90-day public comment period on that exposure draft on the 13th of December. We closed that on Friday, the 15th of March. So in fact, it was 92 days. And at the close of that public comment, we received 85 submissions on the exposure draft, and those submissions were signed off directly by 110 organisations. In that count, we haven't excluded, we have excluded any member organisations where, for example, a peak body has submitted. We haven't counted those into the direct number. And we also haven't counted organisations who have been flagged as expressing support in the body of the document. Some of the submissions contain references to, say, for example, other investment institutions who provided support but didn't directly sign off. We did also receive an additional 2 submissions after the deadline. So Bastian may want to pick that up as a discussion point. Do you want to come back to that? Yep. Okay. Okay, so in terms of what we did during the public comment period, so the public comment, we really focused on wide-ranging promotion. We wanted to get at both existing stakeholders for GRI, so those that are aware of GRI, but also new stakeholders who are less familiar to GRI but perhaps had particular expertise in the tax area or in fact in the investment space as well. As you know, one of the questions that was asked during the field test and in some of our discussions was the use of this information once it's published. And investors were identified, of course, as a key potential audience for that information. So during the public comment period, we did have coverage in tax and sustainability publications such as Accountancy Daily, Tax Notes International, Responsible Investor, Triple Pundit, or publications like that. We also hosted or partnered on 10 stakeholder events, so these are in-person or virtual events which were attended by around about 250 people. We partnered with the likes of organisations like VBDO, which is a Dutch association of investors for sustainable development, UNPRI, Accountancy Europe, and similar organisations. And those particular organisations that I just mentioned, of course, were in light of our goal at accessing tax professionals and investors. We also hosted an engagement at GreenBiz in the US, which is a very large sustainability conference, so had a chance to also meet with a lot of sustainability colleagues. We held an in-person consultation session in Johannesburg, which was very well attended. And also we had a couple of multi-constituency webinars, of course, as per our normal protocol. And we had about 100 people attending those. So a good turnout. This promotion and engagement resulted in around about 4,500 views of the project page during the public comment period and, of course, the 85 submissions. So just to give you some quick insight, I've just divided the submissions here, and in fact we've divided the organisations down by constituency. I've also handed out a list of all of the organisations who provided a submission. You can see there that we had a large proportion of submissions come from the investment constituency, and then the remainder, so over 50% of organisations who provided a submission were from the investment constituency, and then the remainder were pretty much evenly spread amongst the other constituencies. Just to flag, we did have 17 organisations who had marked themselves as other, but on review by the Standards Division, we could see they actually fell pretty clearly into one of our constituencies, and you can see those on your list. I've also added to the list that's been handed around, because this was requested by a GSSB member when we last met, the industries and also the size by employee numbers and market capitalisation of the business enterprises who provided a submission. And you can see the industries that are covered up there. Okay, and my final slide, which is what we're going to do moving forward. So we've obviously got 85 submissions to review. Some of them are incredibly detailed. So we'll take a little bit of time to analyse those comments. We plan to have up to 4 additional technical committee meetings this year. And at this stage, we're looking to include an in-person meeting in that schedule. So of course, we had one at the commencement of the project, but we think it would be worthwhile to get together again and really go through the comments we've received in some detail. Now, the tentative plan is to then come back to the GSSB with the final standard in late Q3, early Q4, so the September meeting. But we would also plan to come back in advance of this to the GSSB, probably at the June meeting, with an overview of the comments. Of course, I haven't actually given you any insights today, and an indication of the response that the technical committee is proposing in response to those comments. So that brings me to the end of my slides. Bastian, I'm not sure if you'd like to add any more comments before we take questions.
Well, maybe only if you can go back to the stakeholder slide. And I think we returned a couple of times over the last 2 or 3 years to the discussion that investment institutions were not participating adequately in our processes, and it wasn't quite clear sometimes whether the standards that we're writing, where we always have by definition investment institutions on the technical committees and project working groups, would also be resonating with the wider investment constituency. And we've invested quite heavily, as you know, over the last years in building up more of a track record of engaging investment institutions in particular. I think this one clearly stands out also in the history of GRI for a public comment, to have more than 50% of the institutions coming back from investment. That's special, and I think it is probably also owed to the subject matter, because in particular the UN PRI has been driving this with investment institutions, but many others too. And it is a subject matter that receives a great level of attention right now anyways. The other thing that is positive, and this is just having read through the submissions, is it is very constructive feedback, as Mia said, sometimes very detailed feedback. But I and the team, we feel very comfortable that this is a good input to further develop what we've put out for exposure. So it is not mostly a response that says we don't like this or we agree with this, but no further commentary on how to refine the standard itself. It actually holds sometimes very detailed commentary on particular elements of the exposure draft, which is a positive as well. We're in a good position to advance the discussions with the group, and as Mia said, in June we can also provide you a more detailed overview. I think the other thing that I should mention is that we're planning to also publish the comments received later this week. to make this also accessible, but also we were receiving, of course, from all the ones that have submitted the question, well, did you receive it in good order? So just to make also public statement around that at this stage. We will not add any level of interpretation to the commentary at this stage. We just make the comments received publicly available now. Then Mia raised one issue, and that's something that we see with every exposure, again, is we have right now 2 submissions that we've received after the deadline. And strictly speaking, we cannot actually acknowledge these submissions as part of the exposure because, of course, you open then a dynamic where very many ask for an extension, and you start to, after 90 days, you make it 100 days or 115 days, and it probably never ends. Having said that, stakeholders have put, of course, a lot of effort into compiling the submissions. So what we propose to do is to provide you and the technical committee also with the submissions that were received after the deadline, but clearly label them as received after the deadline, and probably in the public record also do the same, so that we don't lump them together, make this distinction, and highlight the fact that we really encourage organizations to adhere to our exposure period. But it's not out of 85, 2 is actually quite manageable. We had instances earlier where, well, up to a third of the submissions was either very late in the public comment period or actually past the deadline, and that's not a dynamic that we're seeing here. And overall, I think maybe that's one last observation is that it is quite interesting to see that very many of the submissions come from institutions that have never engaged with GRI directly, with GSSB processes and projects before, for different reasons, but they're really coming forward, and they also demonstrate that they're actually quite knowledgeable about what we do. That's also an interesting fact, I think. Thank you.
Evan.
If we acknowledge submissions that come in after the deadline, how do we insulate ourselves from the governance concern that we're actually considering those in the interpretation of the feedback en masse? I mean, I understand that some things didn't make it by a certain date on the calendar, but how hard and fast have we been in the past about acknowledging submissions and even in interpreting the submissions in terms of our thinking if they didn't follow the proper feedback format?
I think in the past what we did is we basically sorted between the ones that were received in and they were part of the public record, but also were acknowledged as the ones that have influenced the draft in terms of the well, consolidation of comments and what we issue at the end of the project. I think for what we have to have a look at the 2 submissions that we've received, whether there are actually substantive contributions there in terms of feedback that would change the opinion of the technical committee. And I would suggest to just look at them at face value, and maybe they're just falling in place with all the other submissions and don't make a difference. In case they make a difference, I think then we have to have another discussion and raise it with you. But I think our view right now is if there is, for whatever reason, I wouldn't call it a fatal flaw, but an important piece of feedback in these 2 submissions that changes the standard to the better, we should not ignore it at this stage. Understanding the governance concerns that we have.
We may also have a situation where there are materials in the public domain that the technical committee might want to take into account, but which haven't been formally received as comments externally. So if there's been an article published, for example, or something like that, then I think the technical committee ought to be free to take on board these things, even though they're not sort of part of the public comment process. Do we have a sort of a way of identifying that kind of, outside the public comment process, not submissions, but information sources?
Yeah, so we're trying to trace as much as possible of these kind of developments as well. Over the course of the project, we have brought this back to the technical committee on a regular basis, and also now in the background with the all the efforts to promote the public comment, what's in the public domain will be fed back to them. I think it's fair to say that also the technical committee members have been quite engaged in the public comment, promoting this in their personal networks, and they've been following the news on this as well, so they've brought things forward to us. And it's a very dynamic environment, tax transparency at the moment. There are lots of things happening in parallel. So I'm sure there are elements that they will bring that were not known just 6 months ago when they basically looked at the core of the proposed standard.
Orly.
Yes, thanks. Just a question, Mia. The discussions and the processes around the public sessions that were held, the events and so on, are those recorded anywhere, and how are they taken into account? Because I remember the session in South Africa had some really useful comments, but on a very quick reading I noticed that those people didn't comment in the formal process. So how are you bringing that in?
Thanks, Corley. Yes, so in addition, of course, we run these consultation sessions, which is in order to encourage people to provide formal submissions, but as part of those processes, we're also collecting feedback. And in fact, in some of those consultation sessions, the way that we collect feedback is quite structured. We had quite a couple of engagement activities, in particular at the Johannesburg session. So what happens with that information is it gets aggregated and anonymised, and similarly to some of the contextual information that you're talking about, Judy, we still take it back to the technical committee for their information. It just doesn't get a formal response to it. So the people who've submitted public comments, they are the ones who will see essentially their comments public, and then we need to respond to those. The other information that we collect is more sort of additive, I suppose, to those submissions. But certainly when information of importance, we've had commentary around terms, for example, like about the definition of jurisdiction. Now, if we don't find that in the public comment, we'll still take that information back to the technical committee because it came out of the consultation sessions.
Thank you. Any other discussion, questions? Bastian, what would you like from the GSSB at this point? From the volume of the comments themselves means that we're not able to actually sort of look at and evaluate any of it, and it will be a little while before we can do that. What can we do now that would be useful to the process? Either of you have a view on this?
Well, I think at this stage, we will keep you informed. The team will be working on the analysis of the comments. We will start to discuss with the technical committee. If we come across issues that need immediate attention of the GSB over the course of the next 2 months, we will raise that with you in between the scheduled calls. And if there's a need to schedule an additional call, we will signal that to you. Right now, there is nothing that has come to our attention that would need an input of the GSB today. Maybe one ask is, when we now continue to promote this project, and also when you can, where you can help is we put out a press release this week to acknowledge that the public comment has closed, that comments have been received, and if you have opportunities to promote this so that we actually signal that we're taking up this commentary as part of our due process, and further educate stakeholders on how all of this works out, and when also the GSB will look at it, that's greatly appreciated. That's maybe where you can add most value at this point in time. And then in June, we hope to be able to give you a clear signal of whether or not we can conclude this process by September.
Maybe it's also worth raising for the GSSB members the kind of external profile that some of that the project generally has achieved, and the fact that, I mean, I know, for example, there's the sort of comment from the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund recently. I mean, there's been a number of commentary sort of indications of interest in this project that's sort of beyond what we normally, what we expect to get sometimes. Is there anything to be said there that could be useful?
Well, I think one thing GSB should be aware of is that for the investors, there were multiple parties that have really driven campaigns to get very many institutional investors behind this call for more transparency. And they will continue to advocate and make their case in the public domain. So there will be more, I think, public statements around this project and the expectations that they have, which is very positive, I think, because one thing is we always wanted them to come to the table and have more of an opinion about our work, but the other thing is also directionally, it is addressing one of the main concerns that we've heard across the first months of the project is, are there actually groups that want this type of information, and can they articulate what exactly they want? Here we have now a good set of opinions about this, and it will be interesting to decipher the nuance there.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mia. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Kirsten.
Just one comment to the last Bastian said there. I think that's a very important part of it. Well, we all want more transparency, but we need to make sure that the transparency is for a purpose, that we are able to set the right reporting standards that somebody can use for something useful and not just reporting for the sake of reporting. And we've seen that also in some of the legal requirements, that it's not always funded on the basis on what is needed by the users of the information, but by chance it just happened to be like that. And we have to avoid, we should do our best to avoid that in this case.
Absolutely, and I think where we touched upon this point in the GSB meeting in September last year, and I think where, at least upon first read of the commentary where we are now, is actually we have this level of feedback where it's not only just an endorsement of the type of information that is asked of the standard, but there's nuanced feedback also from the different constituencies on how to make this a practical approach to tax transparency. And again, we will summarize that for you and then present considerations also vis-a-vis the different stakeholder groups and their perspectives on this.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think that probably brings us to the end of that section. We have next on our agenda, we have a short break. Do you want to take that break now, or should we move on to...
I think we take the short break, okay, and then for coffee, maybe 10 minutes.
Okay. Very good. Well, we'll come back here at 1:15 and reconvene to the next part of the agenda. Thank you very much.